welcome to Bias-Free Predictions. I'm the host, Sean, and today's topic is rule by executive order. Rule by executive order isn't an academic term. It's something that I just threw together, and it's what I believe ought to be questioned since it's a new kind of governing in the United States that's never truly been around. But thanks to very specific circumstances being fulfilled, it's possible today. Before we start explaining it, we have to start by talking about the process of how a law is made. The law is almost exclusively made by legislation through an act of Congress. There's also judge-made common law, which relies on precedent, and common to most Westphalian governing systems, there's also constitutional law. That's laws written in the Constitution. Now, moving away from how those laws are made, we have to also talk about the role of the president before we understand executive actions and executive orders. Formally speaking, talking about the president, the role of the president is to be both the head of state and the head of government, head of federal government, that is. And this is in difference between Britain or Australia, Canada, where the Queen of Britain, the Queen of Australia, the Queen of Canada is the head of state, but she is not the head of government. She doesn't tend to the day-to-day affairs, but she does give legitimacy to the government that's been elected in her name, and this legitimacy also helps the state to understand who is in charge, right? The Prime Minister is the head of government, and that's the person who steers the ship, who actually develops government in the name of the Queen. The role of the president, according to the Constitution, is supposed to be both, but not be a legislator. Okay, he or she, as the president, is not supposed to introduce bills into the Senate or the House of Representatives. And this is where executive orders come in, because those do come straight from the president's office. So talking about the history and what they're meant to be used for, executive orders were used to lead the nation's interest through times of crisis such as war, natural disaster, or economic disaster. They've been used in the past to encourage or discourage regulation, promote or revoke civil rights, and direct state agencies. Now, the thing about them is they are not in the Constitution. There's no section that says this is an executive order and this is what it's meant to be used for. This has actually been read in by the Supreme Court. And it all started with a good old guy named George Washington. He instructed federal officers to prosecute citizens who were interfering with the war that was going on at the time between England and France. Now, of course, America, or at least George, didn't want Americans to get involved in a war that they weren't ready for. They just wanted to stay out and focus on their own interests. Congress was out of session at the time, which was a huge inconvenience for Mr. Washington, because he didn't want to get wrapped up in a war, but he didn't have time to wait for Congress because Americans at the time may have been getting involved. So he had to act. He had to do something. So he wrote a proclamation, basically saying, you will be prosecuted if you interfere. So this was a proclamation, though. This was an executive order, and a distinction was later drawn that a proclamation is an executive order without input from other branches of government. It started being used more frequently by presidents. Presidents have issued higher numbers of orders actually based on the challenges of their times. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt had the most executive orders out of any other president, and they were the presidents during World War I and II. So obviously there's a need for it there. Interpreting how this tool can and should be used depends on the president and their administrative actors and whoever's working alongside them. Teddy Roosevelt led the way here in showing how it should be used. He helped to really push how it should be used today. He adopted a stewardship theory of executive power, and he believed the president should do everything not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution to lead the nation. Okay? He was the first to test how far he could really push his agenda through executive orders against Congress and the Supreme Court. Now, there's a particular case relevant here that's relevant to him, goes to show how far he could push before basically you fail. And this is the Youngstown decision. The decision from the Youngstown decision prescribes the legitimacy of presidential authority, okay? And it has 3 different levels. So starting with the first level, the president acts with the most authority when he has the express or implied consent of Congress. He or she has uncertain authority in situations where Congress has not imposed its authority, either by inaction or indifference, and the president takes advantage of this zone of twilight to make an executive decision. And finally, the Prez has the least authority when taking measures incompatible with the express or implied will of Congress. This threatens the equilibrium established by the constitutional system. Okay, so there you go. Those are the 3 levels. And the most important thing to take away from them was express or implied consent of Congress. That ingredient needs to be there. And this is why a president's executive orders are pursuant of what's called a grant of discretion from Congress, okay? And today, now that the Senate and the House of Representatives, all of Congress, are controlled by Republicans, a grant of discretion can be more easily attained by President Trump. So it's a lot more easy to get executive orders passed now that they're not going to be challenged in the Supreme Court, most likely. And that's actually in difference to the previous administration. I'll talk now about Obama's contextual use and George W. Bush's Jr.'s, his use of executive orders, and how that relates to us today, their legacy. Now, starting with Bush, he approved mass surveillance within the country after the 9/11 attacks through the NSA. And he also limited the public's access to the documents of his office. Now, when he got these 2 things passed, he framed that this was all for the protection and security of the nation against terrorism. I don't know how you feel about how these policies were justified, or if they were justified, or if they're even very effective. But the point is that he succeeded in getting them passed, and we still have mass surveillance today. Instead of a crisis like war and terror, Obama's obstacle was actually an obstruction in Congress. He really tried to draw a distinction through executive orders between himself and his predecessors by removing torture, waterboarding. He tried to close Guantanamo Bay, which 2 years later he had to reverse with another executive order. He also tried to make new appointments that Congress wasn't approving, and he tried to do it through executive orders. Now, Obama has tangled with the Supreme Court many times. He lost 96 cases and won 79 cases. Every president has a record of wins to losses in relation to the Supreme Court. Obama had a different governing mindset. That probably explains why he lost more often than he won, because he famously declared that he would go it alone without Congress to pursue his mandate of change. What he did was unconventional, and the approach likely contributed to a higher loss ratio when brought towards the Supreme Court, because he didn't have the express or implied consent of Congress. Even if it was all Republican, the point was that he didn't have it, so he would have had to work with them in some way. And they knew that. That's why they were able to bring them to court, and he lost. Trump, in difference, has the consent of Congress and Republican leaders, so he can basically do it more easily. He doesn't get those challenges, or at least he wouldn't get the challenges from them. Now I'll look a little bit more into the challenges that Trump may have. Now, he already has his orders being challenged in several lower courts, but since they followed legal convention, in the sense that they followed this express or implied consent of Congress, I think they may be overturned. And pending them being overturned, they could still be stopped by members of Congress. They need I think it's a Senate 2/3 majority of, I guess, rebellious Republicans and Democrats who would be against those orders. In the meantime, if they can't get those votes, then congressmen who are opposing Trump can try to do something more clever, like they could try cutting funding to the agencies who administer or enforce these orders, which would also be very difficult to pull off, and it's a little bit more unpredictable because there's tricks. So I said you could cut funding, you could try to pass some kind of loophole law, in which case we'd have to see if Trump would veto those. I'm not sure, but it's still going to be really challenging. Executive orders now are being used to expedite goals under Trump rather than Obama, who was trying to, get his goals done, get things done, even if he has to fight Congress to get it. For Trump, there's no fight. And it's become a trade-off sort of deal where Trump gets some things done and Republican leaders get some things they want done. So they just say, okay, we'll be fine with this stuff, we'll be fine with this stuff, you be fine with our stuff, and then just approve. That's a very quick style of rule, quick style of governing. Anyways, I'm gonna move on to the last bit of my segment, and that's my conclusions and opinion. Policy can be reversed, walls can be knocked down. It may take a few years, but things can change. And I think experimenting with policy and measuring its effects teach us what we can and should do or what we should not be doing. Obama's legacy was hurt by his approach to executive orders. I don't want to talk about like the merits or demerits of his policy, but I think his approach to using them so aggressively may have hurt his reputation and even added support to Trump during the election. But the irony is Trump is going to now be abusing them, but he's going to be abusing them with the consent of elected officials. So it's like, it's almost like Trump is doing the very thing Obama would have wanted, and probably other presidents before Obama would have wanted. This is what a lot of presidents would have wanted to do. I think it's worth noting that the last safeguard still remains the Supreme Court. Even with Trump doing the nominations and Republicans doing the vetting, Obama, for example, appointed justices who later ruled against his administration. It's not like there's any loyalty between justices and the president or members of Congress. Like, they're still there to do their job. Trump is very likely to nominate someone who agrees with his policy stances. He'll stop him if he thinks the president is writing up laws that are against the Constitution or behaving unconstitutionally. I just don't think it's likely there's going to be some kind of conflict of interest. So for the trajectory to change course, I think Republican senators and congresspersons will have to pipe up, betray, or somehow the relationship between the branch leaders is going to have to break down. And those leaders, of course, would be Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, John McCain, and there's other people I'm probably forgetting. But predicting how it might break down would involve looking at these actors' individual interests and seeing where they might collide, what areas of policy will be big friction points. I don't know, it could be like social policy, who knows. I think that's worth looking up if you really want to get into it. I'm not going to get into it here though. Otherwise, I think rule by executive order will continue for the next 2 years alongside more protests and more riots from people who disapprove of the policies being pushed forward with such ease. And those people are also probably feeling, very disenfranchised. But you just got to wait till the midterms. Until then, I can't see, aside from maybe a few, as mentioned before, new loophole laws being passed or being attempted to be pushed forward, I can't see how things are going to really change until the midterms. Do you think Trump will overreach like Obama tried to? And if the relationship breaks down between him and Congress, do you think Congress will become Democrat eventually? How do you think the relationship would break down within 2 years' time if that actually did happen? Do you think there's a double standard at all between measuring Trump and Obama and their use of executive orders? And do you think there should be new control measures or executive limitations explored? And that should be a topic for society to discuss? And do you think executive orders are an opportunity or a failing of American democracy? Because, there's an opportunity right now to get a lot of stuff done really quickly. Because theoretically, one day there could be a Democrat president and a Democrat-controlled Congress, and it'd be just the same thing, right? But anyways.